Four-star Army General Barry McCaffrey, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, governor of Mississippi, and Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, and the Chief of Staff for the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, Allison Jaslow, who is also a former Army captain who served 2 combat deployments in Iraq. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I thought it was important to make sure that we had the perspective of people who had served as we talk about this story that has just consumed the country over the last week. General, I want to start with the circumstances around this mission. Why, if you can just kind of lay out for our audience, why is it troops would have been in Niger? What do members of Congress know about it or not? And does the military need to be more transparent about our missions overseas right now?
Well, as a 4-star Marine commander up in Stuttgart, Germany, who runs AFRICOM, and there's troops all over the region. They're in Djibouti, they're in Somalia, we're running airstrikes into Libya, they're clearly in Niger, Mali. They're more normally on classified missions. Frequently it's a training optic on why we're there. But we're also running Tier 1 special operation teams in and out of these nations on occasion, very highly classified. The whole point of it was Libya leaking arms and money after the fall of Gaddafi. And the potential for ISIS to then take up residence in other parts of Africa. So what did Congress know? I don't know. But I know the Secretary of Defense normally keeps the key committees in the Senate and the House, the chairman and the ranking member, informed of these operations.
Right, and of course we had Mattis heading up to Capitol Hill late Friday to try and make nice with John McCain, who was clearly pretty unhappy. Mr. Secretary, what, you know, you've been on kind of the inside the Pentagon when things go wrong. What should happen now as far as investigating what happened here and trying to kind of figure out and explain how to keep it from happening again?
Well, the first thing is there ought to be a full investigation, and to go to what General McCaffrey just said, be transparent about it. Get the lessons learned. What was the mission? What was the level of danger that these troops face? Because we've got troops, as he said, all over Africa and all over the world. The day I left, we had Marines in 43 different countries. Knowing what the risks are, knowing what these young men and women face is absolutely crucial before you send them into harm's way.
Allison Jaslow, you obviously spent a lot of time talking to, you know, current vets and people who are currently serving. From what we know, at least preliminarily, about what happened, these men were traveling in trucks that weren't armored. They didn't have air support overhead. Is that standard, or does that, you know, make people angry when they hear those kinds of details?
Well, I think there's a lot of unanswered questions that we were hoping that we would get, and unfortunately have found ourselves in a conversation around the fallen and their families and condolences instead of getting the answers to those tough questions. So what I really hope is that we are able to get to the bottom of that. And I think, you know, the Secretary said that there are questions that and strategic clarity that we need to give to troops, but their families and the folks especially who are putting their lives on the line absolutely deserve that. So I hope that we get answers soon.
And this, of course, has been the debate very quickly shifted into the realm of the political with kind of President Trump. He started it obviously on a week ago. It feels much longer than that now, saying that, you know, President Obama didn't call the families. Do you think that this debate at this point is appropriate? I mean, what role does the president play here? Does he bear sole responsibility, or is it on the shoulders, and we're going to get to in a second some of what Congressman Frederica Wilson has said, but is this something that's good for the country in your view?
Well, you know, a quick backtrack. I've been a lieutenant or a captain on 3 combat tours, wounded 3 times. There is nothing that outrages me more than hearing every time we're in contact and take casualties that somebody made a mistake. It's dangerous out there. We're all carrying guns. We don't follow massive intelligence failures. A squad-sized American unit. So again, I'd be a little cautious about wrongdoing on the part of the people on the ground. Strategic clarity, probably more important. Now back to the current uproar in Washington, I think it's disgusting. My first reaction was to tell the President of the United States to stop calling families, to stop going to Dover. Let the Sergeant Major of the Army or the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps bring these our fallen angels home. And I think the other thing is, you know, we've clearly got the President of the United States with a boneheaded phone call to a widow, followed by exploiting it on the part of a congresswoman, followed by the President immolating himself with further treats. So we've taken our eyes completely off the ball. 4 special ops, highly trained troops killed in action. We need to honor them.
Speaking of kind of all of that back and forth, let's walk through some of that. Chief of Staff John Kelly tried to reset the conversation about the deaths of these 4 servicemen, but the dialogue veered wildly when he took on Congressman Frederica Wilson at an event from years gone by.
The Congresswoman stood up, and in the long tradition of empty barrels making the most noise, stood up there and all of that, and talked about how she was instrumental in getting the funding for that building, and how she took care of her constituents because she got the money, and she just called up President Obama, and on that phone call, he gave the money, the $20 million to build the building. And she sat down, and we were stunned. So let me tell you what happens. Their buddies wrap them up in whatever passes as a shroud, puts them on a helicopter as a routine, and sends them home. They're flown to Europe, where they're then packed in ice again and flown to Dover Air Force Base, where Dover...
So that was John Kelly talking a little bit about, and those weren't necessarily supposed to play one after the other, but I want to focus on what we just heard there. And Allison, I want to ask you about this. This is not something that most Americans are familiar with or understand. And sort of John Kelly laying out kind of step by step what it is that happens when one of our service members is killed abroad, I think certainly was something that a lot of people were riveted by. And, you know, we are very distracted kind of by the noise that has ensued in the politics around it. But my question for you is, do you think that the country is damaged by the fact that there are so few Americans who at this point are familiar with what John Kelly was talking about there?
Well, absolutely, and I think that, you know, the way that that rears its head is seeing the unforced errors that we've seen a little bit. I think that utter disconnect is probably at the heart of why we are, or I hope it's why we're in the middle of politics, that people are just disconnected, because otherwise it's pretty heartless in my mind. What has happened to this family is not only a tragedy that most people can't relate to, but it's now in the headlines because of politics. Unfortunately, Sergeant Johnson was just put in the ground yesterday, and they had to endure 5 days of political back and forth. And this is now something that's going to be wrapped around his legacy and the unfortunate death that he's had from here forward. That's a horrible thing that's happened to this family now, and I think we should all reflect on that.
Mr. Secretary, is there anything that can be done to change that dynamic, to make more Americans aware of what our service members are doing every day?
Well, I think it's a danger to democracy when the people doing the protecting get too separated from being protected. And I think that we do a disservice when we say only the people in the military can understand, only the people who have served can understand, because Americans need to have that connection. Democracy needs to have that connection. If we get a separate military class, if we get people removed, and yes, there are things you can do. There are things like making sure that, I mean, I brought ROTC back to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, because it had been gone for 40 years since Vietnam, but I also put it at Rutgers and Arizona State, the 2 most diverse campuses in the country. It's making sure that we don't just thank people for their service, that we actually understand what they do. It's making sure that we as Americans understand we get the broadest possible representation, that our military looks like and relates to the people they defend.
General, how does this play out at the highest levels of government? I mean, we in this country have a long tradition of civilian control of the military, but in some ways, certainly I hear from a lot of Republicans on the Hill, when they are asked about their concerns about our president, they will point to the three men in uniform who are standing there and sometimes describe them as kind of the bulwark against chaos. Is that how you view it? And do you think there's any danger in that, in having essentially the military, which, you know, is a smaller, we know, day-to-day portion of our society?
I've known General Kelly for years. I think he's one of the finest people I ever met in my life, bar none. Man of tremendous integrity, good judgment. He actually understands Washington. He's been the OCL, the congressional liaison guy for the Marine Corps for years. I think he handled this one very badly. He's emotionally vulnerable on this issue. He doesn't like to talk about that great son of his killed in action. I think personally the president threw him under the bus by referring to him as the answer to the tweet storm that came up. H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, half the time has been a military officer. It's not unusual. The only unusual is Jim Mattis being the Secretary of Defense as a retired fourth-star Marine. And I personally think that the country ought to be grateful that this guy of good judgment and a law-abiding person with tremendous experience, who I might add is nearly worshipped by the armed forces, particularly the Army and the Marine Corps. So I think we ought to be grateful we got these guys in office. I don't think General Kelly ought to quit for any reason and stay with this president as a voice of good judgment and responsibility.
General Barry McCaffrey, Secretary Mabus, Allison Jaslow, thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. I really appreciate it.